Okay, hello, welcome everybody. So this is a talk through psychoanalytic thinking and the psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic therapy groups. And it's I think a very important topic, psychiatric diagnoses. I think for many of us working in the field of psychoanalysis and working with patients, I suppose in some way, dominance of psychiatry, I think, certainly in South Africa, in the mental health field is quite an issue, topic. Anyway, so today we've got Stijn Vanheule, who's going to be have a conversation that's facilitated by Leon Brenner. You know Leon, he's done a few talks, and we've done a talk with Stijn last time, Lacanian on depression and melancholia. Hi, Leon. And we've also got Derek Cook, who's there, and he's going to come in with some questions. So I'm going to pass you on to Leon, who's going to facilitate and host today. Okay, thank you, Leon.
Thanks, Mike. So everybody's here. We can start a little conversation, even a small party together. So it's really my pleasure to have Stijn and Derek together here to discuss these topics. There's a lot to say about these guys, but basically we're having two of the, I think, clearest voices in the world of Lacanian psychoanalysis today, and that's very clear from the publications that Stijn and Derek do, and also their appearances online, which I'm sure many people here in the audience already know and have visited. And today we're going to talk about diagnosis and just have a conversation. And I'll just start by starting with a certain topic or question, and we'll take it from there. So we start from Freud, as usual. And Freud has this paper on beginning the treatment from 1913. And in this paper, Freud talks about this initial stage in an analysis where the analyst has to do some, let's say, preliminary work. And one of the issues that Freud raises in this paper is the issue of diagnosis. So for Freud, it was important that the analyst would reach at a certain diagnosis at this preliminary stage of the analysis. And Stijn, we'll start with you, and we'll have Derek joining us very soon. I'll just pose this question. Stijn, maybe you can tell us and the audience a little bit about why was it so important for Freud that a diagnosis would be established at this time of the analysis?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Leon, for that question, and for inviting me, and also Mike for inviting me for this interview today. Why would it have been important to Freud? Of course, we can only imagine what Freud exactly meant. But I think diagnosis in that context means actually that a clinician should really get acquainted with how someone is functioning, what the key dynamics of someone's mental life is, and that in Freud's view on diagnosis in those days, that it was about that, not so much about giving a name or attributing people to a certain illness category, but rather like finding out, the logic of how someone is dealing with intimate issues, how someone is dealing with pain, with shame, with sexuality, with death, with conflict. This actually was Freud's focus. And we can also see this when we read Freud's case studies, that actually that's what he's looking for. And when he's giving a name, like a diagnostic name to a case, it's always in terms of this dynamic and of defense mechanisms. And this, I guess, was what Freud meant in those days.
That's, of course, somewhat, let's say, in contrast to what many practitioners, mental health practitioners today refer to as diagnosis. I mean, I have some of my best good friends who work in the field speak about this sort of administrative official thing that they have to do in the beginning, the intake, to write something on a paper and send it to the health insurance, maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, well, lots of things change, of course. And this is one aspect that nowadays diagnosis is part of an administrative system. But also, we also see that diagnosis is something that is now claimed by people. For example, when you look at TikTok, I assume that you're there, Leon, checking TikTok. But right now, TikTok is quite popular amongst especially young people, because there are many videos there of other young people often explaining diagnosis and making kind of a caricature of what we know as clinicians as the DSM, meaning like criteria linked to specific psychiatric categories that are then explained in layman's terms by people who actually don't have a training, or maybe they have one, but don't really have a training in the field of mental health care. So what we see is now that there is really a proliferation of diagnosis and of diagnostic talk. And nowadays, like many people who consult a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst or a counselor, they really enter our therapy rooms already with the diagnosis, like I have ADHD, and as if this is a fact. And as if this is already some kind of an explanation as to why they are suffering. And obviously, this is completely different than what we started with when you referred to Freud, because here we have rather like a name which often serves a defensive purpose, like it's in the confrontation with an enigma, with something that has not been understood, that suddenly a label is accepted by a person or found by a person. So now the situation is quite complicated, because it's both in the field of just everybody in society who is doing lots of diagnostic talk, and of course there is an entire administrative system using these labels. And then the joke of everything is that actually the scientific basis of it is so poor, is really so poor, that it's actually hilarious that both like management systems and people out there in society use these labels, because they actually don't represent much.
Yes, they have come to represent something, as you've said, that is completely different than what Freud had talked about. That is for sure. I mean, I know some people, for instance, that would prefer to give a diagnosis of autism, for instance, to a child, because the child will receive more money from the government. So diagnosis has become an economic factor on one hand. And on the other hand, as you're saying, these words, these social media signifiers, they have accumulated somewhat of a social value, social capital. A self-diagnosed ADHD, it means something. It chains you to a certain group, and it helps you explain something about yourself. And that is something completely different than what Freud had talked about, clearly. And I think we should
it's also interesting, of course, to see that when nowadays people use these diagnoses, and when they start looking for those diagnoses, it's often at a moment of misencounter, something of not fitting into a certain system, like a child in the school system, or a partner in a relationship. It's often when something of the difficulty of not being in touch with the other, or not being in touch with yourself when you're relating to another, So when this point arises, it's often at that point that something of the question of a diagnosis arises. Like, for example, in a marriage, I'm thinking about someone from my practice when suddenly, for example, the man needs to be diagnosed. His wife thinks that he's suffering from autism because there's such a problem in addressing him and talking with him about emotional topics. And then you see it's like at a very specific point. It's the moment where there are cracks, for example, in a romantic relationship, when something of a certain fantasy that was linking people together is breaking. And then, of course, there is suffering and a not understanding and a certain kind of sadness and perplexity. And it's at this point that there is this search for diagnosis, often combined with the search for a professional who was asked to come to help, but often in their own minds in terms of the diagnosis that they have already been giving to themselves. So often when we start clinical work, it's starting anew, because it's a matter of not believing what people enter with. It's not that they are liars, but it's rather that the diagnosis that they are giving themselves is covering up something, and rather than revealing something, it's revealing that there is a problem, but at the same time it's covering up in more general terms, in more like shared terms. And this gives like a feeling of shared understanding, because when we refer to ADHD, we have the impression maybe that we're talking about the same across different situations. But this is exactly, of course, what when something of a diagnosis is covering up, it's covering up something of the particular. And then as a clinician, this is what we have to go to the questioning of the very specific, because this specific person with his or her specific history, with this kind of specific context where they're living in. And this is, of course, interesting. And this is important, just to open again this kind of sphere that Freud was actually pointing to, like getting acquainted with a person, with an individual, with the history, with desires, with fantasies, with disappointments, rather than with a disease category, because nobody is equal to a disease category.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the general that covers up the particular. And we see this, as you say, among these the patients that come and see clinical practitioners, but also we see this in the mainstream, or let's say the statistical manuals.
Yeah.
Both of the major ones, the one from the World Health Organization and then the American DSM. How would you, let's say, elaborate a little bit about these, and maybe of a certain problematic that we might identify in these to the people listening to us today, which I'm sure many rely on these statistical manuals in their work. So let's open that up a little bit.
Yeah. There is, of course, an entire history around these manuals. So the manual DSM, such as we now know it right now, is actually, well, it has its current form since the early 1980s. 1982 is the moment that the DSM-3 is published, and that was the first like big diagnostic book in psychiatry that started from criteria to make diagnosis, which opens up the era of checklist diagnosis. Like, for example, you take major depressive disorder, and then you have a couple of possible symptoms that are listed really as a checklist in a book, and then a patient has to have a number of symptoms from the list, and if he or she has enough of these symptoms, a diagnosis can be made. So this kind of diagnosis is there since the 1980s. Before that, there was another form of diagnosis that was dominant, and when we go to the early 20th century, then we see that we have more of something of a narrative diagnosis, which starts from prototypes. And what is this prototypical diagnosis? This is, for example, what we see in the handbooks written by psychiatrists like Bloiler. who was the one who invented the concept of schizophrenia. And for example, in his psychiatric handbook about schizophrenia, you have in a certain edition, you have something like 70, 80 pages, a description of what schizophrenia is, typical symptoms, but also examples from clinical practice to illustrate what he's actually meaning. So you have something of a story about schizophrenia. And in those days, a clinician was invited to think in terms of the entire body of thoughts around the diagnostic category and to compare own patients to the patients described in the literature and then make an own diagnosis. So it was like an intellectual effort that needed to be done by a clinician with all its frailties, because the human mind is selective. So also the mind of a clinician. And this is something that, that was actually in the 1960s, when many things in society were questioned, there was also a strong questioning of psychiatric diagnosis, meaning there were some studies that actually pointed out that there was something very random in the diagnostic practices of those days. Maybe I can point to some experiments if you want, but anyways, that led to a deep disappointment with this more like relying on the knowledgeable psychiatrist, and they wanted to have more like a scientific system. So the trust was not in the psychiatrist as an individual with a mind, but more into the system that would be objective. So therefore, there was this cry for a system, a diagnostic system. And then gradually it was in a group at St. Louis, the Washington University in St. Louis in the United States, where there was this group in the late 1960s and early 1970s who were the so-called neo-Kraepelinian psychiatrists, and they wanted to start anew in psychiatry. I wanted to start from a scientific basis, and they said like, we have to compare our discipline to internal medicine, and our organ is the brain. And just like in internal medicine, diseases have specific symptoms, we have to make lists with diseases of which we are pretty sure that they have an organic grounding and specific symptoms and a specific kind of evolution. And that's how the dream was born of a new biological psychiatry. And then what we also see, of course, is that in the late 20th century, biological research and psychiatry really took an advance, like imaging techniques entered into the field of psychiatry, brain imaging, but also like really the study of the genetic code started to gain lots of terrain. And then there was this dream that within psychiatry, we would find something in the brain or in the genetic materials that would be linked to those diseases. So therefore, there was this first, the disease categories were all invented based on symptom groupings. And then the hope was there that the biological rooting would have been found. And what we see in the publications around 2000, when the preparations started for the DSM-5, with which we are currently dealing, then this dream is very much alive, and they're really relying on advancements and their preliminary results that are really promising, and they want to kind of further elaborate the system. But then in 2013, DSM-5 was published. And actually, when you now take the DSM-5 and you compare it to the DSM-3 from the 1980s, when there was not yet biological research, but the hope for biological research, actually almost nothing changed. For example, in terms of major depression, the criteria are just the same. And again, in the diagnostic handbook, there is no speech at all about biological markers, because none has been found at this level, nothing. And for example, also the same is true for psychosis research. They really hoped, especially in terms of schizophrenia, that they would find strong differences at the level of the brain and at the level of genetics, but it ended up with a really big disappointment for biological psychiatry. And so now, of course, we are in an age where at a scientific level, this is really now documented that there is no biological basis. What is also documented is that purely from a psychological point of view, and then I mean more the statistical psychological point of view, because many psychologists are very interested in statistics, that the validity and the reliability of the system is very weak of the DSM. The problem is that meanwhile, the system has been adopted by management systems and therefore is living a life on its own. And when you look again at the history, that's where the DSM actually started. The DSM and the first versions of the DSM were invented early in the 20th century just as an administrative system in the United States, because across the country there were different big mental health hospitals, and they just wanted to compare a little bit the populations across these different facilities. And therefore they made what they said themselves like very reductionist checklists that people could just use to have more of an overview across the population of potential mental disorders. But that in those early days, nobody who was actually working as a clinician took it seriously. It was just administrative. But the thing is that since psychiatry itself was under fire in the 1960s, it's actually the silly administrative system everybody was joking with, every psychiatrist was making fun of in the early 20th century, actually became the dominant model later on. And now we're fed up with such a system, which is actually like, yeah, very poor from a scientific point of view.
So what makes us cling to this system so much today? What makes the institutes cling to this system?
Yeah. I think it's many different things. Like, first of all, there have been decades where people in the general public have been informed by psychiatrists and by the popular media that we are almost at the point of a breakthrough in biological research and psychiatry. So we're all brainwashed at the societal level with the idea that maybe in the end it is something that has to do with your brain and with your genetics. And this message is still very strong in our collective minds, so to speak. And this is why we're still holding on to these systems. But when you look at meta-analysis in biological psychiatry, then you see that this is not true. And so I think that the scientific message that this hypothesis is not correct is not yet entering the popular discourse. This is just starting. Take, for example, because I've been doing quite some research, as you know, in the field of psychosis. Like, for example, the heredity of psychosis has, in earlier days, was estimated at around 70–80% would be hereditary of the problem of psychosis. But since then, so this was a message around 2000, but since then, we know the genetic code. And so we can now actually study at the level of the genes how many variants in the psychotic symptoms are explained by the variants at the level of the genes of people. And then we now observe in meta-analysis that this is only 7–8%. So only 7–8% of the variation in the psychotic symptoms can be explained by the genetic code, which is showing that there is no promise at that level. So genetics won't explain psychosis. If there is something that is playing at the level of cross-generational patterns of psychosis, it surely has to do with the social as well. It has to do with how people live and how traumas maybe are transmitted from one generation to another, both at the level of families, but also at the level of subcultural systems in which people are living. So now it's clear that it's really not just about biology, but also about how people live. And this is all very new and is not yet accepted in our collective minds as something relevant about psychiatry. So we still have this dream, this collective dream of it is in the end biological. Yeah? So I think this is one problem. And of course, another problem is the problem that was very well described by Foucault and by Nietzsche, which is the problem of reification. And what does it mean, reification? It's the illusion that is created the moment a name is given. And so the moment you adopt the name to name yourself or your problem as ADHD, you start to believe that this name, that this signifier, is actually related to a specific referent, that there would be a referent at the level of the body that is responding to that name. And so many people, when they accept a diagnosis for themselves, think that actually it says something about their brains, that their brain is wired in a certain way. And the same is true, for example, for psychosis. But then again, when we look at basic research on the brain in psychosis, for example, there is no real difference between the brain of someone suffering from psychosis and someone who's not suffering from psychosis. The only differences that have actually been observed are very small, mean differences. And the differences that were observed have no clinical value at all. For example, what we do know is that on average, the brain volume of someone who is vulnerable for psychotic episodes is a bit smaller on average than someone who's not vulnerable to psychotic episodes. But actually, this has no clinical value at all. We don't know what it means. It's just there. And another thing, for example, that we know also like a small average difference is that the psychomotor development and speech development for people who later develop psychosis is just a little bit later, a couple of months on average later than someone who's not vulnerable to psychosis. But what does this mean? We don't know what it means. We don't know anything what we could do with this at the clinical level. So this is what has been observed at the level of the brain. What has not been observed is, for example, that certain areas in the brain would not be working very well, or that certain communications between brain areas would be deficient. That's not what has been observed. There is no difference at that level. And at the same time, when people use these names, they start to believe that actually there is some change at that level. And that's the problem that Nietzsche and Foucault pointed to with their concept of reification. And reification is, you could say, like something of a thought error when you, in which you attribute material reality to a name, whilst nothing is proving that there would be a material reality connected to it. But these are two very strong tendencies, like the popular message from scientific research on the one hand, and on the other hand, the question of reification.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it's also the psychiatric world who stimulated both tendencies, because if people believe that there is something biological about a mental health problem, there is it is quite justified to ask the government for money to do research on it. So those doing research within biological psychiatry have often been surfing on the wave of the popularity of that discourse, often by publishing results in journals, starting from smaller samples and preliminary results, and then saying like, okay, we found something and now research is needed on a large scale and big populations, and that we need more money. And this is often what you can see in psychiatric publications, especially from a couple of years ago, when there was this demand ever and again for more money to finally prove the point. And so also like governments and funding agencies are also eager in sponsoring this kind of research. And then you have like a self-fulfilling prophecy rather than sound scientific thinking. And I guess here we have a basic problem. We have a basic problem globally at the societal level.
Indeed, and I think that at this point we can take a step forward and then ask you, Stijn, well, what is the alternative? What is an alternative that would be maybe scientific, but not in this, not entrapped in this scientific fallacy that you've just been speaking about?
Yeah. So my idea is that the best way to be really scientific is to be really psychoanalytic. And that is not referring to some kind of a romanticized idea about psychoanalysis or the kind of the distant psychoanalyst, because this is also like a media figure of the psychoanalyst. That's not what I'm referring to. It's not the caricature of the analyst, but it's rather the fundamental idea that when we enter into a dialogue with someone suffering from a very specific problem, when someone is having a symptom, that we have to contextualize the symptom. We have to contextualize the symptom in terms of people's life history, in terms of how people give meaning to situations in their lives or fail to give meaning to situations in their lives, and therefore like go to contextualized understanding. And in Lacanian terms, that would mean that we shift away from the idea that the clue of diagnosis is the finding of the right signifier for a biological referent, because this is what the assumption of the DSM diagnosis, and it's rather assuming that the signifier is linked in a signifying chain and has a very person-specific signified, like the meaning and the reason and the function of a symptom or a certain kind of suffering is really to be understood at the level of the specific situation of someone. So my idea is that if we want to rethink diagnosis, it is about taking that very seriously and to kind of revalue the idea of case construction. This is where it really matters, case construction. And what is case construction is like entering into the life world of someone, getting in touch with their problems, but also getting in touch with the logic of how they defend against their own problems, and maybe also by doing so produce their own suffering to a certain extent, or continue to be grasped into a certain loop of suffering. So trying to get hold of the logic of someone's functioning, misfunctioning, that's for me the clue of diagnosis. And the good thing is, well, because this has always sounded as really soft. If you would say that to a psychiatrist, it is this, or someone with a purely medical background, you would have said that like 20 years ago, people would say this is not scientific. But the good thing, I believe, is that meanwhile in the social sciences, we shifted to not just accepting statistical research as really good research, but there's a growing openness for qualitative research. And so what is qualitative research in the social sciences? That's starting from interviews with people. It's starting from participatory observation in people's life situations. And then a qualitative researcher would typically like study really in big detail the accounts that they collect, and then do very systematic examination of what is there, of the logic of what is there in the narratives or in the materials that have been observed. And so there are certain rules as to how to proceed with that. And I think that these rules, these ideas for quality care, for quality control, so to speak, in qualitative research can be abstracted or can be taken also in clinical situations. And if we do so, it's actually a plea that the clinician must document very clearly why he or she is drawing a certain kind of conclusion starting from session materials. So that's always, and again, the obligation, you could say, for the clinician. So don't come with hasty conclusions, but stuff your conclusions with specific incidents, with specific observations, preferably over sessions. So on the one hand, so then you build like something of a validity in your case formulation, but there must also be reliability, and reliability is something also we can construct by checking our conclusions with colleagues. For example, therefore, also from a purely scientific point of view, things like supervision or group discussions among clinicians, or presenting cases at conferences and discussing these in a very open atmosphere is most important, because when we do this, we kind of expose our own vulnerability in the fact that we are actually we as clinicians are also people who give meaning to situations. And when we talk to someone about our own construction work, that's the best way of remaining somewhat open, and maybe that what you conclude from the materials is not the final conclusion. So you can check your conclusion with colleagues. And this is actually, I think, an example of what the scientific mind is doing. The scientific mind is a mind that is inquiring, that is exploring details, that is not making firm claims, but always and again open to revision. And I think it's this attitude which is both very psychoanalytic and also grounded in contemporary methods in social and social sciences research that we actually must adopt. And to me, this is the alternative to like checklist diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Yes, case construction. We can get into that, but I wanted to maybe ask you to, let's say, step one more step into the domain of, let's say, Lacanian psychoanalysis, the Lacanian orientation that I think that you abide by, me as well. And maybe we can start with a general question before we get into the under the hood, as they say. Well, if it is not about providing a signifier for a biological referent, why is diagnosis important at all within the Lacanian orientation? What is its function?
Yeah, well, diagnosis, I think, is important. Is important for the clinician. Mm-hmm. It's of course like a certain shift in how we think about diagnosis, because often in the psychiatric sphere, it is as if a diagnostic label is something like an ontological claim, as if the psychiatric label is touching the being of someone, like the essence of who someone is, of how someone functions. So often it's beyond also the belief that it's touching something beyond the word, like something of the brain, something of the body, something inscribed into the flesh. So that's the idea that a psychiatric diagnosis is for the patient. And for me, in psychoanalytic contexts, a diagnosis is actually for the clinician. And why is it? Because as an analyst, I always assume that I don't know the other, and therefore it's another. So this means that in the encounters that I have with someone, I will never be able to grasp who the other is. And that's exactly the definition of the other. There is a certain aspect of otherness there that cannot be grasped in a diagnosis. And that's the starting point. This is also something that Bion, for example, Wilfred Bion, took into account. He said, like, every session is a new beginning. You have to listen again from scratch. And this openness is what is needed. But then again, of course, when you have several consultations with people, you do start to hear a certain logic in what they are saying. And not only a thematic organization, not only like a continuity at the level of the content, but also a certain logic in terms of how people deal with the painful aspects in their lives, like with the existential challenges, or with the non-rapport, we could say from Lacanian perspective, how there is not a connection, fundamental connection with the other. So, but how do you deal with it? And then, of course, from a theoretical background in Lacan, we know that some people deal with such situations by relying on conventions. This is what we call neurosis. And then we have obviously also the possibility that convention is not giving an orientation. For example, in giving shape to a partner relationship, when convention is not guiding you, there is clearly the possibility of really going like not knowing how to deal with the partner and to really become crazy because of the situation. And that's what we call psychosis. And so that's helpful for a clinician, because if we take these different logics into account, we can orient our own interventions and the way we ask questions, but also give little remarks about people's stories, or check how they can organize their lives with them, inviting them to talk. That helps us to have some direction for ourselves at that level. So that's why it is needed for me as a psychoanalyst to guide me, so that me, I'm not doing random things, and to have some stability. So it's something to navigate, so to speak, through the transference, rather than naming the essence at the level of the other.
Yes, that is it. I think diagnosis has value in the sense that it contributes to the direction of the treatment.
Yeah.
If it does not, then what are we talking about? Yes, some, as you've mentioned, some essentialistic theory of the other. You know, many people here are not aware of how diagnosis works in Lacanian psychoanalysis, because, you know, we're used to these categories like depression, like borderline. These are very popular categories that people associate with a diagnosis. But how does it look like then in the Lacanian orientation?
Yeah, like, I think that in clinical situations, typically from Lacanian perspective, we won't start by giving a diagnosis to a person. So since the diagnosis concerns the transference and how we, as an analyst, as a therapist, deal with the transference situation and guide ourselves through the interviews with someone, it's not something that we will typically communicate to a patient, because then it gives the suggestion that actually it is an ontological name for something. So therefore, as the Lacanian analyst will hardly give a diagnosis to someone, like a diagnosis in terms of what we call the structural diagnosis. Typically, Lacanians distinguish between neurosis, psychosis, perversion. This is not what we will communicate to the patient. And of course, many people, when they start consultations, they do want a name for the condition because they already search for a name. And so they're at that point, I think, pragmatically speaking, we will often agree with giving a name to the condition. But that name is a name for the suffering, knowing that at a certain point in our clinical work, we will challenge that name. So, for example, if someone is coming and is drinking lots of alcohol and is naming the situation like, I'm addicted to alcohol, so indeed agreeing on the fact that this is a problem, the addiction onto alcohol, this is a starting point to kind of agree that this is a symptom. This is something that you're suffering from. I agree that this is a problem to work on. But then again, typically as a Lacanian analyst, we will go beyond the illness categories that are often described in the literature. And for example, maybe challenge someone, like for example, someone might come and say that that she's depressed and cry a lot in sessions. Then maybe as an analyst, I would say to someone who is doing this, like, in my opinion, you're not depressed. You're the most saddest person out there. You have a certain sadness. That's what you're suffering from. So working with little shifts in signifiers in the hope of naming something more specific, person specific, and then inviting why and how that name is embedded in a very specific logic, because then it's breaking out of these, like more conventional ideas about a specific disorder, like, because often people who say that they are depressed are also thinking that something is wrong with their neurotransmitters in the brain. And so, for example, by naming then as a most deep sadness that they are suffering from, or a very big disappointment that lots of problems getting over that disappointment, this is something else. It's still naming the suffering, but it's going away from the idea that this suffering or that name is connected to a condition that has certain consequences. So it's rather like giving a name, but it's still with a signified that is a bit vague. But if the meaning connected to that word is a bit vague, it's actually an invitation to examine as to how this specific sadness, for example, started and how it continues, and why at a certain point it was much bigger in life, and why now it's so hard to deal with. So it's always an attempt to go to the very specific, and also pointing to the what we would say to the real, like meaning to these points that are really disorienting for people, that they don't understand, that provoke deep anxiety or make them flee into drugs or want to make them think about suicide. That's the real. So giving names to a situation that are like wrapping a little bit these most fundamental difficulties that they're coping with, and then trying to construct something of the story around it. I think that's that's usually what happens during early sessions of Lacanian work. And if that works, of course, we have a start in really like talking with someone, and at the same time being in touch with the very specific of what someone is living through, about what is happening to someone.
Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, as you've said, interventions vary. And you've mentioned that there are these three major categories in Lacanian psychoanalysis: neurosis, perversion, and psychosis. And well, you've also briefly mentioned that each of these dictates a different positioning or a different handling of the transference. Right? And for Freud, that was crucial, the handling of the transference.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about that, so people will have a certain feeling of what we're referring to here. How does diagnosis on this structural level affect the analyst's positioning in the transference?
Yeah. So the ideas, for example, when I said a minute ago, like neurosis is living in terms of conventions, then we link to the idea of neurosis that indeed it's a matter of conflict. It's always the question of the desire of the other and positioning oneself in relation to that desire of the other, and trying to separate from the other and to articulate your own desire. And then your own desire again is not uniform, because on the one hand this, on the one hand something else. So there is always something dialectical there. There is always one idea versus another idea. So it's a clash between ideas. So if this is neurosis, this guides us to a way of intervening and a way of listening, where we always invite people to say something more. And to say something maybe a little bit different than what they had been saying, because in a certain way, they're only saying half the truth of things. So if they say they're very sad, we don't actually fully believe them, because maybe they're also like joking about the same situation or very aggressive in the same situation. So when they say they're very sad, there is another aspect to it that is maybe not compatible with the first idea, but it is there. So that leads to a certain way of listening and a certain way of speaking. And this is very in line with what Freud called at the technical level the free association, because Freud says, like, say anything that comes into your mind. It's an invitation to stop filtering with your ego what you believe the other wants to hear from you, or trying to disobey the image you want to impose onto yourself. So it's a quest for a certain openness, such that the dialectical tension between different tendencies into yourself can be expressed. This is neurosis. But if we have psychosis, and there the situation is that there is much more of a certain being in touch with the key problem and not having ideas at all as to how to deal with specific situations. And then knowing that when people try to engage with a specific situation purely on themselves, that it tends to have kind of a disintegrating effect, then we know, for example, that it's not a good idea when you're doing therapy and talking with people to just stimulate free association, because you won't enter into a field of dialectical tension, but rather enter into a field where someone completely feels lost by what is being said or being asked by the analyst. So therefore, if that is the problem, if it's not like something of a conflict with conventions, but rather like a deep despair about the not knowing how to live or how to be or how to deal with the other, this leads to what we call more like a conversation, more like a dialogical situation where ideas are being exchanged and questions follow up one another, and where something of the continuity of speech is very important. And because in neurosis, you could say there is always a continuity of speech at the level of the fantasy, because there's always the fight between different internal tendencies. There's always continuity of speech. In psychosis, this is often not the case. And so because there is this confrontation with despair, deep despair, and so therefore we have to try to be there with words around the situation of despair and helping people to not disappear into these situations. And so therefore it is important to have this diagnosis, because it leads to a different approach of problems.
Yes, clearly. And I think this is a distinction maybe that we can make between the way Freud addressed the diagnosis of psychosis at the beginning, in a way being a bit wary of handling it at all within psychoanalysis, and Lacanian psychoanalysis, as many people can read. Stijn, you write a lot about psychoanalysis in your books, and there is in fact a dialogue with madness, as Foucault was saying, happening in this orientation.
Yeah,
I have some more question I wanted to ask you, but I also wanted to call Derek in. He was willing to join us today with some questions, so maybe we can add Derek to the talk. And Derek, why don't you pose a few questions, and we can continue the dialogue from here. We'll take about 15-20 more minutes, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Leon. So Stijn, some of the questions that I was scribbling down as you were speaking, you've in a way anticipated, but a couple of them are, well, I was going to ask you, under what conditions might you be willing to share a diagnosis? But maybe more significantly, and this is one I think you've already responded to by centralizing questions of the transference, what exactly is being diagnosed in a structural diagnosis? I've got some thoughts on that. I know you have as well, but that seems important, because having already signaled the reifying function of how diagnosis works in other approaches in mental health, it seems significant, and also bearing in mind that, you know, Lacan spends a lot of time rallying against the objectifying qualities of psychological discourse. We would want to think a little bit about what exactly a diagnosis refers to. And I suppose one of my answers to that would be that in many ways, a diagnosis situates us, gives us a map for how to position ourselves as clinicians, rather than necessarily a kind of reifying, objectifying identification of something within a patient. So that's the one question. And then the other is, there's an interesting paper by Danny Nobis when he talks about the temporality of diagnosis. And of course, he's riffing on the famous, you know, prisoner's dilemma, logical time. So we have this sense of, do we instantaneously rush to a diagnosis, which will give the clinician a relief of anxiety and some sense of reassurance? Or is there a time of comprehending and a moment of concluding? So, you know, that's a second interesting dimension to the question. What is the temporality of diagnosis? And then I suppose the third thing is just to say what occurred to me when you were talking, particularly at the beginning, is how much there is a sense, both on the part of clinicians and on the part of clients, analysans, patients, that there's a kind of méconnaissance function, a huge relief and misrecognition delight or reassurance in being able to locate myself in terms of this signifier.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that came through very nicely. And I suppose what you would then say is that this is something of a kind of imaginary function that we see within the cultural preoccupation with a diagnosis. So I just one last comment there is just to say that what that sometimes means then is clinically, it's significant what people bring and have done their self-diagnosis, which increasingly seems to be the norm, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Have done a little mini project, online research, and have come up with a diagnostic structure, or no, a diagnostic label or signifier, which sometimes gives them this kind of relief, and this explains everything. But what that often then means is, if that signifier starts to box them in to a categorical kind of mode of understanding oneself, maybe in certain situations it might be useful if it alleviates a great deal of anxiety, but it also means that presumably analytic work is a kind of working against an initial diagnostic méconnaissance, because if that initial diagnostic label is something which works against the agency of the subject, right, by making them always want to comprehend various facets of their life in terms of this signifier, then you could say that part of a psychoanalytic treatment is in a way to kind of undo a diagnosis. Anyway,
Yeah.
just a couple of comments.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick in to some of the aspects here that you're mentioning. And first of all, there is the point of anxiety. And I think that's a very important one, because that's often, I think, the motivation to give a diagnosis is anxiety. And it's both anxiety at the side of the patient who is not understanding something. And therefore, since a lack of understanding about themselves or their situation occurs, they want a name for it. And if something of a decent name is found, it's working as an anxiety fighting thing. So it gives some peace of mind, and that's why people love it to have a diagnosis. So it has to do with anxiety at the level of the patient. And I also think that also many people who are being trained as an analyst and who are in analysis themselves are struggling with the question of the diagnosis of themselves. Like, I do remember it from my own analysis that I was always thinking about a certain diagnostic category that I would fit in. And then, of course, in the end, when looking back on these ideas that I had in my analysis right now, I must laugh about myself, because I don't think it was accurate what I was thinking, but at the same time, it was probably helping me in not questioning some aspects of myself by fixating my own thoughts around a specific category with which I could be identified. So it has to do with my anxiety as an analysand at that point. But the same is true, of course, at the side of the analyst. And I do think that the analyst or therapists often give diagnosis in terms of their own uncertainty and fight the uncertainty with the diagnosis. And that's also why I think that it's kind of an interesting situation to observe that in Lacan's teaching, by the end of his work, he really gradually went away from the question of diagnostic categories and more talked about what he said, subjects, speaking beings, like just people. And people are organizing their own mental reality in very specific ways. And then he developed that own new language, like we see at the poster that is just behind you, Derek, in terms of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, like those rings. This is an effort to go away from the idea of you have categories, you have neurotics, psychotics, and perverts. That's not Lacan. That's not Lacan's discourse. No, you have people trying to construct reality, and sometimes it fails, sometimes it works, and we have to study the details of what is going well and what is going wrong. And this is the analytic work. And so that's kind of very interesting that also Lacan goes away gradually from the idea of this classification. And of course, this is an important distinction also in terms of the vocabulary that we use. Nowadays, classification and diagnosis are used as synonyms, but actually the DSM is a classification system, and we deal with it as if it is giving a diagnosis, meaning like an adequate name for something. And for me, a diagnosis is more like a formulation, the formulation of a logic, the formulation of what we've been hearing in someone's speech in a very accurate, precise way. That's for me a diagnosis, a precise formulation of a situation. And maybe we can't classify all those very precise formulations about someone's situation in terms of these categories, in terms of the classification. And I think that's important. And therefore, also at the side of the analyst, it's important to deal with the idea of diagnosis as just a hypothesis, also as something that can change across time. And it's not because you're changing diagnosis that you are doing the wrong thing in the period before changing the diagnosis. So maybe it's a changing diagnosis is telling something about a change that is needed in terms of how the treatment is going. So it's something more flexible for me than rather the idea of it's statical, because if it's a static thing, it always suggests as if there is an underlying reality to which it is responding. Whilst for me, it's something that helps to organize your thoughts about how the social bond, the bond with the other is organized, and the other is the unconscious, is the otherness of the other in the personal contexts, and that's what we try to grasp with the diagnosis. But then also a last thing, Derek, what do we communicate with patients? Well, often if someone, for example, needs a diagnosis, for example, you're a student and you want to have specific facilities for your university, or you're a child and you want, or your parents want extra support for you at school, then what I often do is just take that book, take the DSM, and read in it and check with people like, okay, these are your complaints make me think about the following. And then I read, for example, the criteria and ask the person if he or she agrees that this is something of an adequate enough description to put on the form, knowing that it helps you to navigate and to live your life in a decent way in society. So I just deal with those diagnostic labels in terms of surviving in a very complex world. And there I take the ethical position that I want to support my patient. And if the diagnosis at a certain point helps, we can help giving them a diagnosis, but at the same time, starting from an attitude in which I make clear that I actually don't believe that this is like the name for the condition. And it's rather like, it's like money that passes from one hand to another. It's a signifier that passes from one situation to another. And if it's a key that opens a door, why not? But at the same time, make them clear that it's only a key to open a door. So meaning that I don't believe that this is actually the name for what they are suffering from, that if we want to get in touch with what their problem actually is, we will have to leave aside that name that we kind of strategically embraced in a first moment. Yeah.
I mean, lots of people have got queries, so I'll just offer another 2 comments and be very, very brief about it. But that's very helpful. Stijn offered a lovely conceptualization at a previous talk that he did when he said something along the lines of, we should bear in mind that when one is offering a diagnosis, it is much more an indication of something of the positioning of the transference rather than it is an ontological statement on an individual. And I like that. It was really nice. I mean, my way of, as I've mentioned, of locating it is also to think about how a provisional diagnostic sense is a map for what might be indicated and might be valuable for a certain piece of analytical work. I think those things fit together, but I suppose what I just did want to emphasize is that perpetual, perennial temptation to somehow surreptitiously slip back into those kind of statements. Well, psychotics are like this, or this is psychotic. Like, it's very difficult to keep that space open, to not start thinking in case formulations or whatever, that we're still once again reiterating a general categorical notion of what this person as a psychotic person is. So I just wanted to stress that.
Yeah, and I think at that level, we really should make the similarity with other categorical distinctions that we have, like, for example, distinctions in terms of race. Does it make sense to say like black people are like this and white people are like that and yellow people are still different? So when we say these things, it becomes clear that it's also a field of prejudice. And therefore, the clinicians also should take into account that very point. If we make generalizations like psychotics are like this, and neurotics are like that, and people with addiction are still a little bit different. So maybe we're entering then a field of a certain kind of identity politics from which we want to stay away, because we know from our clinical practices that this is exactly what people are suffering from. that they are suffering from the things that have been said about them. You're a man and therefore you're the following. You're a black person and therefore you're as such. And then people suffering from those claims that have been made about them. And so if we as clinicians would add additional claims with our very specific jargon, then I think it's dangerous. And therefore we should be very wary of discussing work with an individual in those terms.
I'll just add then that, I mean, that's, completely, I agree with you wholeheartedly. One of the things which is likely to incur a degree of anxiety in colleagues who are working in a different way is that if there is a temporality and an impermanence and the possibility of shifting and moving within a diagnostic space, that kind of goes against the more mainstream culture of psychotherapy and intakes where one has to have, fairly quickly some kind of diagnostic label. So just to stress that as well, not only are we kind of de-ontologizing diagnostic pronouncements and diagnostic statements, but we're also trying to suspend the need to fix it within a short period of time. The last comment I have, which we don't have to take up, it may not be where we want to go, but I was reminded actually also of something that Danny Nobis had written in terms of perversion. And of course, he wants to take some issues with whether we should think about perversion as a structure. So I don't necessarily need to open up that whole debate, but one of the things that he offers, which I thought was very interesting, is he says often you would find in the case of, and I'm probably slightly shifting his description, but one has to be aware of, does he call it a countertransference diagnosis, whereby because, for example, a given analysand causes you a great deal of anxiety and something about the way they talk about their sexual life engenders a certain something in you that you might be more tempted to say this is a diagnosis of perversion. So just to throw that in there, that a diagnosis also will presumably have that challenge to it of how one might want to, as a clinician, distance oneself or not be that thing, or utilize something of a sort of countertransference reaction might be present in certain forms of diagnosis.
Maybe I can add here a question, and Derek, I would love it if you could also engage with it in terms of temporality, as you've mentioned, and as Stijn was put very clearly, that in the Lacanian orientation, we are not dealing with an ontology, but with maybe something we can call an ethic. These categories, and Nobis is expressing that, and also Stephanie Swales is also about perversion. Is it really a category that we could determine as a diagnosis? But then, in psychoanalysis, we have these three, and they've been like that since a very long time. And I was wondering if, do you think that the Lacanian orientation offers us a way to view these categories as, well, let's say maybe changing in the long run? Or have they changed so far? Is there a dimension of temporality that is not only internal to the duration of analysis, but to the history of the social bond? I was wondering what you think about that.
You're asking sociologically, historically, or in terms of subjective suffering?
In terms of subjective suffering, in terms of the suffering we see in the practice, are we able to think of a time where a different handling of the transference would be in place, would be necessary?
I mean, let me just say something, because if people are a little bit new to the Lacanian approach, the question is always like, well, why only these three? And can I move between them? So just to say something very basic about that, the idea, which I think is very, very substantial and robust, certainly in terms of psychosis and neurosis, the idea is what specifies or what underlies a diagnosis. And in some respects, the whole notion of a structure, what it's really about is a fundamental stance of defense and negation in respect of traumatic and negativity, right? So that when we make that slight shift, it starts to sound a little bit, perhaps, it sounds somewhat different. Now, if one's fundamental orientation to what causes pain, what causes suffering, which causes psychic discomfort, is something within the remit of repression, then that is neurosis in its various forms. And if something of one's fundamental stance, fundamental pattern of being in the world is more premised on a more, as it were, maybe as a different modality of defense, which in Lacanian terms, and borrowing a bit from Freud, would be considered foreclosure or foreclosive in some ways, then that situates oneself within the domain of psychosis. And so sometimes when we have these debates, it's almost like I feel like saying subjects for whom repression is their mode of being in the world, as opposed to merely neurotics or hysterics or obsessionals or whatever, and subjects for whom a mode of foreclosure is the fundamental mode of being in the world. That some ways that seems to open it up and make us think about it, maybe in slightly less reifying or objectifying terms. The further point to add on that is once we've said that this is a way of being in the world, repressive or foreclosive, whatever, we should also stress that there's an infinite variety with which one might find one's way, although one still utilizes a series of basic mechanisms of repression. Right? So I think that helps as well. So instead of categorizing and boxing in all of the variety of human experience into 3 categories, to bear in mind that there's almost an infinite variety of how one might situate oneself historically within the contingencies of one's life with reference to the modalities of repression. So just to say that, and I think, you know, there's interesting things to say about hysteria, because the term even sounds funny to many of us. And it's maybe a slightly different debate to say, how do we see these different sort of structural entities manifesting and appearing historically? In my experience, there's something about obsessionality that still seems to be fairly similar across history, actually, which tells you something about obsessionality, whereas hysteria, interestingly, seems to take on quite different forms because it's very much about history at some level. So I'd say that. And I think ultimately, one of the things which distinguishes a Lacanian theoretical orientation from some other approaches is Lacan is often a lot more clear about historicizing what he's trying to do than is often the case in some forms of psychoanalysis. So presumably we do need to think about these categories in historical terms. And then last question is, does this mean that perversion, which is, to build on what we've said already, is a kind of mode of being in the world, which also entails a fundamental defensive orientation, and that would be that of disavowal. We could then say, as some people are saying, is that structural in the way that the other structures are structural? Which again opens up some debates. But maybe to bring my thoughts to a conclusion, maybe one way of approaching these diagnostic categories is also to open up the breadth, the variety, the flexibility within the mechanisms of repression, within the mechanisms of foreclosure, and within what is entailed by and operationalized by disavowal. And if one is listening to and attentive to those modalities, that's one way of being able to track some of the how people suffer, how they defend against their suffering, what is the way they make sense of things. And maybe that does that without closing down so much by simply the imposition of 3 basic signifiers: psychosis, neurosis, and disavowal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would still add to that maybe the idea that when we talk about psychosis versus neurosis, that we should stop thinking about it as categories, because this is something that Miller at a certain point suggested, that it's better to think of these as fuzzy sets. So a fuzzy set is not like a clearly distinguished group where you have clear demarcation points that define the difference between this and the other, and then you can check really very precisely the differences, and then you're really sure. And that's the idea of a categorical distinction, whilst a set is like a collection that is that might be very varied in itself, very much internal differences, and no strict criteria that define all the cases within the set, but still there is a certain coherence within it, and one set is not strictly discernible from the other. I think that's a good idea to stick to that, although it is a bit vague, and although it's very theoretical, but that obliges us to go to the case level and to discuss very precisely what we believe is going on in an individual's life. And I think that at this level, psychoanalysis can make a difference with other approaches in psychotherapy, because other approaches in psychotherapy usually build on the categories. Like, for example, when we see the switch to manualized therapy and to criteria, or to also reimbursement for very specific disorders, and then you have treatment protocols for these. This is believing that these in between categories, in between constructions that are at the theoretical level not very refined, but also at the clinical level not very precise to get in touch with an individual. I think that from a psychoanalytic point of view, we are not believing that the solution is there in this middle kind of construction, but rather let be guided by abstract theoretical ideas and link it to very precise clinical situations. And then it's exactly the kind of discussion that clinicians would have amongst one another about their clinical work. This is also part of what I believe makes up the scientific practice of psychoanalysis. It's an intellectual dialogue that should be as open as possible, and that should be as documented as clearly as possible. Also, when we talk about the clinic, and therefore this also requires, of course, an openness at the level of the clinician to disclose how you think and how you work, what you do, what the effect is of your interventions, what stupid things you did, and what the effect is, what interesting things you did, and what the effect is of it. And this is, I think, the way to progress from an analytic ethics within contemporary society. So it's a bit moving away from the fuzz around all the diagnostic categories in society to go to the conceptual and the very specific.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a whole topic. We can have another talk with you, Stijn, and Derek about supervision. I know that, Stijn, you've been doing some qualitative research in Ghent about supervision. So it would be very nice to speak about that, but that's for next time, because we have a little time for questions, and would be really, really great to hear some of our participants. So if any of you have a question, just raise your virtual hand, and we'll have you asking it.
Yeah, I see some questions in the chat as well. But
there were some questions in the chat. Anybody posed a question in the chat and would like to ask it out loud so we can have a discussion?
Leon, do you mind if I go? It's Garrett.
Here we go. Okay, Garrett, yes, please, go ahead.
It's very much, it's such an informative presentation. I'd be interested to know, just in terms maybe neurosis and psychosis at the moment in the direction of treatment, how is the structure informing the direction of treatment, and what do you see as the main differences? Because I know that there's Giffrick and all of these different models in relationship to psychosis. And then, if you don't mind, just the symptom in relationship to these two structures. Thank you.
yeah, well, this is a question, of course, that we could engage in for a long time. But I think that I'm just going to repeat something in terms of the difference. What Derek said, the repressing mode, the foreclosed mode of dealing with negativity, with impossibility in life, with challenges. I think there at the theoretical level, the difference needs to be situated. And then in terms of the clinical work, I think it's either assuming, and that's what happens in neurosis, that we have actually a dialectical tension between that there is a clash of ideas within someone, and that exactly in the clash itself, something of the subjectivity needs to be situated. And so that means that in clinical work, it's about articulating the complexity itself and helping people, or letting people live with the fact that they are not one, that they are this composition of these very contradictory things that live within themselves. And so therefore, free association, free listening, is very important in terms of directing the treatment in neurosis, whilst in psychosis, it's more the brutal confrontation with some of the enigmas of human life, and an impossibility to kind of relate to these starting from conventions, because convention doesn't give much inspiration in dealing with it, and therefore it's rather the experience of a certain threatening disintegration of everything that has to do with thoughts in dealing with specific issues in life, and the threat of this very thing, of the disintegration of the other, which, for example, in daily life might also be expressed in a delusion where a specific other might become threatening, but that's actually a sign that something of the big other is disintegrating. There is no internal coherence there anymore. And so therefore, in that kind of treatment, if that is the situation, it's a matter of finding new ways, finding together with people a new logic as to how life might be lived in the end. Although there is this fundamental disorganization that you're facing and in which you tend to disappear, but how nonetheless try to live and organize something that works for you. So this, I think, is the difference in clinical orientation there.
Thanks, Garrett.
Oh yeah, Leon. Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
We have Dee.
Hello, thank you very, very much. It was fabulous. Oh, there's another meeting going on. And thank you, it was really lovely. I have a question, two questions. You mentioned suffering and trauma and patients coming in with these with suffering. And I'm wondering if we treated trauma, if we treated trauma earlier, that at the time of the trauma, would we prevent long-term suffering? So that's my first question. And my second question is, with all the work, and I've got a medical background, with all the work that's going on with immune system disorders, and there's actually now the potential of adding anti-inflammatories to someone's treatment, is there potential that maybe some of the suffering can be ameliorated in the long term? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the question with respect to the medical, I think that from a psychoanalytic perspective, I would say that obviously, if there is biological things that might be added to a therapy and it makes sense and it helps to relieve suffering in an acute moment or maybe on a longer term, of course we should be open to it. But at the same time, we have to be wary and careful, I think, as an analyst, to not believe that the solution is there, because there is a fundamental problem for a human being in living with lack of negativity, and we don't assume that there might be invented something that can fill that.
I agree with you.
Still, of course, if there is something that adds to the health of people, and if a body can be more healthy, of course, that will have an effect on the mind. So therefore, we are not against it, but it's not the entire solution. And then your question with trauma is a complex one, because also I think in psychoanalysis, especially in Lacanian psychoanalysis, we make this distinction between accidental trauma and structural trauma. And the structural trauma is the trauma of the human being. And what is the trauma of the human being is that nature is not guiding us in life, or not fully guiding us in life. So we are an open-ended system in which there is no final answer. And that very observation that there is no final answer, that there is no other on which you can finally rely, which a child is discovering that the parent is just a parent and not like the parent, but just a parent, that's a traumatic thing. And of course, this kind of a trauma, and except living with this kind of a trauma, is still very different, for example, from obviously from sexual abuse or exposure to extreme violence during war. And I think that at that level, well, of course, what we need is careful attention for the human experience when there is when there is accidental trauma, and being there and enabling speech, and of course, fighting against injustice, the injustice that produces these accidental traumas, I think that's also very important, and hopefully it will have some preventive effects. But at the same time, as an analyst, I do believe that the human being will always again produce their own misery. Like if we try to prevent, for example, trauma through sexual abuse in partner relationships or in relationships between adults and children, that is very important. But then again, we know that sexuality for a human being is so disturbed, it's so difficult for a human being to have a decent relation with your own sexuality, that it will lead to transgressive behavior, because this is something that is typical for a human being. So the possibility is always there. So when we fight it at one domain, there is a big chance that it occurs at another domain. Like we see, for example, now that, like in many countries, there is lots of discussion about sexual abuse by priests. And it's very good that this is addressed, but this is not that if we address the sexual abuse potentially in the church, that sexual abuse will disappear, because in a couple of years, we will be surprised that it was in other contexts and we didn't expect it to be there. So it's difficult to, well, we have to be there when the suffering is there, but we shouldn't be naive in believing that we are moving towards a final solution in which the human race is becoming more humane, or the world is becoming less cruel. I think cruelty is redefined over and over again in different ways, and traumatization is going on in different ways. Like, look at the refugees and how Europe deals with people who want to leave Africa and come to Europe, and people drowning in the seas. 700 people died on a boat, and the media is not discussing it. They're discussing like 4 people lost in an undersea boat when they went visiting the Titanic. In Belgium, there's more fuzz about that problem rather than the 700 people dying in when they wanted to leave Africa. So there is suffering that is being produced over and over again, traumatization.
Mm-hmm. Derek, I was wondering if you might have something to add in relation to the previous questions.
So Garrett had asked about the symptom, and it occurred to me, well, maybe we hadn't said quite enough about that, but just maybe one point of inspiration that we could draw from this later formulation in Lacan, which people take and interpret in slightly different ways. One point of inspiration that to think about the symptom suggests that, well, number one, as I put in the chat already, instead of saying, well, how do I locate someone diagnostically, we could ask a series of questions. How does this person find a way in relationship to questions of sexuality, libido, jouissance, bodily intensities, number one. Number two, how do they locate themselves relative to, the big other? How do they have a social link? How do they fit in with a kind of rudimentary social bond? How do they make sense of the symbolic order, social roles, so on and so forth? And number three, how do they orient themselves in relationship to language? So when we ask those questions, we maybe give a bit more texture, a bit more space to think about not so much what has gone wrong, which a diagnosis often does, right? Implicitly, the work of a diagnosis is to say what didn't go right or what's gone wrong, but we're also trying to open up the space for how has someone responded to certain crises and difficulties. Not all of those responses are necessarily all that helpful. Some of them, create more suffering. But I think one of the crucial moves forward with the notion of the symptom is to think about how people find individual specific modes of dealing with suffering and with respect of all of those dilemmas just mentioned above. So just to say that there's something about how the notion of the symptom might be more facilitative of the specificity of given individuals, the singularity of lives and how people respond to things, and also how it may move the question of diagnosis from a kind of deficit model of what's gone wrong to also a consideration of what someone can do and what they have indeed done, the creativity of a given life.
Right. Thanks for that. We have one last question from Cherie, and then we can wrap up. So.
Hi, yes, thank you for taking my question. You kind of mentioned a little bit about qualitative research. I'm wondering what need is there? I'm trying to research psychoanalysis for treatment and mourning and melancholia in a research program currently, but I'm having a difficult time actually finding specific case studies that have empirically derived information. I'm wondering what limitations do you think are there as far as that? If you could give like a specific example in terms of your own qualitative research that you've done in Lacanian psychoanalysis or anything in regard to that.
Well, of course, we are here. These are, for me, these are two different aspects, because on the one hand, we have the diagnosis, which is something that we do in the clinic, which is something that is the confidential sphere, where, of course, the analyst is working, and the analyst is working with the narrative materials and is organizing thoughts about it, and then in a certain way, like indeed formulating a logic, making a diagnosis. And then principles of qualitative research, I think, might help us analysts to be more precise, more open, more transparent in how these conclusions are made. And therefore, the analysts can learn something from the social scientists. That's my point. But on the other hand, of course, we might also do qualitative research starting from Lacanian psychoanalysis. And that's what I do with many of my PhD students and researchers at the department, where we study different clinical problems starting from case studies, but obviously these are people engaging in, or the people that we discuss in those researches are people who gave informed consent to that their case can be published, and that's not just, these cases typically don't start from the clinical interviewing that we do in our practices, and it's more like recorded interview sessions, for example. And so I like to make the difference between both. I think both are valuable, and the clinical can learn something from the qualitative, just like the qualitative research can learn something from the clinical. Because, like, for example, in how to interview someone, if you're analytically informed, this will lead to a different kind of conversation, in which guidance by a structured guide is less interesting, rather than following up around specific topics, starting from the dynamic of the interview itself. But I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
It's always been a pressing concern, I believe, as far as Freudian psychoanalysis not having empirically derived research and association. I think that's why, in America specifically, psychoanalysis isn't really used as a means of application for certain conditions. And so that's the issue that I'm coming across in terms of qualitative research, is getting that information from clients, and also considering the ontological, which I think you mentioned isn't really a necessity within Lacanian psychoanalysis, but I'm kind of also wondering about that as well, why the ontological isn't in consideration in terms of the treatment in Lacanian psychoanalysis.
Well, I think I wouldn't say that the ontological isn't into consideration, but it's rather that it's not up to the analyst to make an ontological claim about the patient. Obviously, what is ontological is the point also Derek referred to. There is something, this is the Lacanian assumption, something of fundamental negativity at the level of being with which we're all struggling. And this negativity itself, that's the ontological point with which we're working. It's not so much that we are being, we're also lack of being. And there is no final name for it. The only name that can be given is something very singular. So every person is actually struggling in finding names for it. And it's not up to the analyst to assume or to believe that, for example, a diagnostic name label might give a name to that ontological struggle. But the ontological, I would say, is
it kind of poses an issue in terms of whether or not it's scientific, if it doesn't have an ontological basis to it, if it doesn't have like a defining measure or defining sense of truth or rationale, I guess I would say. I think that's probably the questions that are proposed, at least in the research that I'm doing. But in the postmodern era, it seems to be like there's less of a focus on the ontological as well.
Yeah, Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you
of
for
course.
answering.
But we're then, of course, starting far less from a realist epistemological framework. So, because this is often in scientific research that starts from a realist perspective on reality, a more positivist view on reality. And I think that especially psychoanalysis is kind of challenging it, because this is exactly why what suffering is for a human being. It is something that has something absurd in itself. And the absurdity itself is key to what suffering is. So it cannot fully be grasped in a realist ontology, I think, or in a realist epistemological frame.
I guess that poses some philosophical problems then, in terms of even what the patient is looking for. If they're looking for a sense of reality, I don't know if that ties in with the Freudian reality principle at all, or if Lacanian psychoanalysis does not have a particular aim of that. I think there was a previous talk about the reality principle that I actually missed, unfortunately, but I guess that's potentially opens up a different dialogue conversation. I'm not too familiar with Lacanian psychoanalysis. I'm more familiar, I guess, with Freudian as well as the client-object relations. So this is all relatively new to me as far as the framework.
Fantastic. And Cherie, you're invited to learn more and join us in future talks.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. And we'll wrap things up. I'll thank you, Stijn, dearly, Derek. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you all in the audience. And I'm sure we'll see each other very soon.